Russia needs to try to take this logistics hub or former logistics hub, because the place has been leveled, of Pokrovsk in Donetsk. It's not enough just to take villages. They need another town to tell their people, huge success. And they could get Pokrovsk, but I tell you what, it's now over a year since they started that assault. So exactly. It's another backmate. So it's not like the Russians are making huge gains. And meanwhile, a story to watch, because I don't think it's just spin, is that Kiev School of Economics did a survey, which has just come out, which is that the Russians are now back. They've depleted their Soviet era equipment, and their level of supply from Russia to the front lines is now back to pre-2022 levels.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now today, on day 1,252 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation or full-scale war against Ukraine, we're talking to Professor Scott Lucas. Now, Scott is Professor of US Politics at University College Dublin's Clinton Institute and also founder and editor of EA Worldview. Scott, welcome back to Frontline.
Hey, thank you for letting me sneak back in.
Yeah, it was always good to have you sneaking back in. Now, as we're recording this, we've just had the dramatic news as Keir Starmer met Donald Trump in Scotland that Donald Trump has dramatically shortened his 50-day deadline to Putin and to presume those that would be subject to secondary sanctions. This move is demanding a move towards peace in the next 10 to 12 days. What's your reading of this?
Well, I mean, the fundamental with Donald Trump is he says a lot of things. And in particular, he's saying a lot of things while he's playing a bit of golf in Scotland, because he's feeling especially bullish because he's got the framework of a tariff deal with the EU. But it's one thing to talk the talk, and it's another to walk the walk. So there was actually a series of statements he made. What was interesting beyond the specific declaration that he's going to shorten the window for Vladimir Putin to accept a ceasefire was this obvious frustration with Putin, that Putin had not listened to him, that he was continuing the bombing of Ukrainian civilians. Trump quite often, clues to Trump is when not that he's, quote, lying or dissembling. When he latches onto something, which he really does believe is true, it's when he gives little details. And it was interesting when he said, Vladimir Putin's not only continuing to bomb, but he's continuing to bomb nursing homes. And what's happened here is that someone has pointed out to him, some people think it's Melania, pointed out to him, oh, by the way, a nursing home was amongst one of the facilities that got hit a few weeks ago in Kyiv. And that stuck with him. And that's what's interesting here is, and he went further and said, look, in effect, he now thinks that Putin will not make a deal. It's no longer that given time he'll make one, he'll no longer make one. I'm very disappointed in him. Okay, fair enough. Now the question here is what he has said is that the 50-day window, which was going to expire on September 2nd, and then he might bring in 100% sanctions, not only on Russia, but on its trading partners, China, India. I'm going to shorten it to 10, maybe 12 days, right? Now, the walk is interesting here, Philip, because you will know this from your experience. And it's important to stress this is it's not just a case of saying, that's it, we're bringing sanctions in. You have to have coordination amongst your agencies. That's intel, that's military, that's state, that's treasury. You have to have your legal people in there to draft the sanctions and to have them ready. Now, what we do not know, because I haven't seen a news organization dig into it and I haven't seen anybody leak it, is whether that draft order for those sanctions has been in preparation once Trump declared a few weeks ago the 50-day window. So if I was actually, out there and doing some chat with some folks in the know at working level, it would be, do you have these orders in draft? That's the key thing, because there's another complication here is, one complication here is that what you and I had been discussing all along has been the possibility that the sanctions would come from the U.S. Congress. And those were sanctions of up to 500%, indeed, secondary sanctions. Now, that was overtaken by Trump saying, oh, I might do it. So that issue is there. But the second, which encompasses both Trump and Congress, is Washington goes on vacation in August.
Yeah.
I mean, Congress goes into recess. A lot of folks go back to constituencies, and even administrations tend to wind down a bit. So is Trump really saying he's going to ramp up his administration in August? Now, you and I suspect, hope he does. I mean, I favor the sanctions. I suspect you do as well.
Mm-hmm.
But again, walk the walk. As so often with Trump, you have to look beyond Trump in terms of what he says is, all right, let's look at the agencies, look at the adults in the room. Is the necessary work going on? And is there the necessary coordination going on with international partners, especially European partners?
Well, if we started trying to talk about adults in the room, we'd go down several rabbit holes, I think. But the immediate reaction on the Russian stock market was it fell by 1%. Now, it's not a crash, but it's a clear signal. Do you think the market movement suggests that Moscow is taking the Trump threat seriously, or certainly the financial institutions in Moscow are?
Oh, I think it's not just Russians are skittish. I think the Kremlin is skittish. I mean, I think if you look at the statements, and it's always a case of decoding. If you decode Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, and that can be a task because I mean that guy, basically every other word is a piece of jargon, right? But if you can finally cut out about 75% of that and get to the core of what he says is he on the one hand is restating the demands, and he did that yesterday, which is, okay, we're only really going to negotiate with Ukraine once we've achieved our immediate aims, which means expanding occupation of Ukrainian territory. And then what he says is effectively, all right, but then we will consider getting back around the table. They are feeling the pressure on that. Economically, that stock market reaction is a combination of things, I suspect, Philip. I suspect it is Trump's announcement coming in, but it's also the fact that the Russians are caught now with that wartime economy between running it on overdrive, which drives up inflation, or trying to curb the inflation and risking sending the economy into a recession. So the big development within Russia in the past 72 hours has been that the interest rate has been cut for 20% to 18%.
Yeah.
Now that might be a little bit of like an arcane fact for many folks, but it's the second rate cut the central bank has done. And it has been because the central bank is under pressure from the economy ministry, which is saying our economy is slowing down. All that drive, that impetus we got from the military spending, that only can go so far. You've got to do more to stimulate the economy. Central bank has been holding out against that because it raises the risk of inflation. But now they're having to give ground. What you're seeing is an economy which in the short term was maintaining itself by just simply funding the war. But at some point it reaches a crunch point. And you and I have discussed this before. The question, and this does not mean, by the way, collapse of Russia. That tired narrative. But when they reach that crunch point, which is both running a domestic economy and maintaining the military effort, then that becomes key. And Trump just adds that little bit of maybe this time he's serious because let's emphasize this, Philip, it's not sanctions on Russia. Sanctions on Russia have gone pretty far. What the U.S. could do, by the way, and keep your eye out for this if they're serious about this, is the EU has lowered the cap on Russian oil from $60 per barrel to $45. That was in the package last week. The Americans have not done that yet. Now, if the Americans are serious, they can put that sanction on Russian oil. But beyond that, of course, when you hit China and India, you're trying to detach them from the Russian economy, not just the Russian military effort, the Russian economy. Would the Trump administration risk doing that with China at a time when it's negotiating with China over tariffs? That's a big question. Will they risk upsetting the Indians further? Because the Indians are not happy with the Trump folks because they thought they were going to get a trade deal a few months ago, and Trump walked away from it and hit them with a 26% tariff. So, if the U.S. is serious, it's that effect on China and India that you're watching for. But again, that's not a done deal.
Yeah. But then, if we look at some of the other indicators that are around, we've had the first reports of wholly supplied Chinese UAVs being found used by the Russians. And therefore that plays into Donald Trump's anti-China bit. We're seeing increased Chinese aggression around the Philippines, and actions around the different island stock that are there. Maybe Trump might do something to jump in and give India a trade deal at the last minute to try and split India and China a little bit more. And then indicators inside Russia. We've got Russia has launched one of its largest naval exercises for a long time, with 150 ships through different fleets around the sea. But it finished over the weekend when there was supposed to be a big Navy Day parade, which happens on an annual basis, for veterans of the Russian Navy. And Putin cancelled that for security reasons. More likely unreliability reasons, and he didn't want to be embarrassed at not being able to put the numbers of ships that he'd normally expect there. Do you think there are little indicators to suggest that Putin can't afford to continue the war, but he has to continue the war because he can't afford not to?
I think, what we do is we look at certain events and we say, not, does this mean yes or no, he can or can't continue the war, but what could be the effects on the constraints? So let's take three different things that you've laid out very well here. First of all, that question of whether there will be a stronger U.S. push against China to try to separate them from Russia. Now, the Biden administration tried to do that, and the Biden administration was pretty coherent. I don't necessarily agree with every step they took. I think they could have been harder on China. They were coherent. The problem with the Trump administration up to now is they've been incoherent on China so far. But you're going to know what's happening here. The reason why we're getting more news coming out about what the Chinese are supplying to the Russians is in part because people in certain agencies are now willing to leak that. Yeah. And that includes European agencies, Ukrainian agencies, and maybe even with American agencies, precisely so Trump sees this, right? They're trying to change the narrative on China. And they're trying, because that means even if the sanctions don't come immediately on China, the Chinese may start to think, we need to put some pressure on these companies. We're overexposed here. India is really interesting. I wish you were in Washington, Philip. We could use you there, man, because that is absolutely the play to make on India. It's the play to make on India, by the way, because of an event in a different arena, which is the Indians, because of Trump's chaos. What did they do? They in the UK accelerated their talks, and they got a historic trade deal a few days ago, right? So if the Americans are actually thinking sensibly economically, they want to get back in with India. But of course, it also has that added effect, which is you separate them from the Russians. Yeah. Now, that's the economic front. Then you have the front of what's happening inside Russia, which is not just the economic aspect, it's the security aspect. Again, Russia, the naval exercises are as much for symbolism and for show as they are for any real military purpose. And then that is that massive embarrassment which came out Monday, because Putin had actually Sunday, Putin had actually gotten into St. Petersburg. Yeah, he was there. There's footage of him in St. Petersburg. He's supposed to show up in Navy Day, and then they scrubbed the exercise. Why did they scrub the exercise? Because Ukraine had hit a couple of key targets overnight, a couple of key plants that support the Russian military, and they closed the airport in one of the key Russian cities that's several hundred kilometers from the border, but then they closed the airport in St. Petersburg as well. Yep. And at that point, if you close the airport in St. Petersburg, are you really going to proceed with this Navy Day parade? So it's an embarrassment for them, to say the least. But that's not the end of the story. As we speak, they may have recovered from it now, but overnight there was a serious hacking attack on Aeroflot, which is the Russian state airline. Now, people out there will probably know the stories about how the airports periodically have to be shut, especially in the Moscow area because of the drone attacks. Now they had to shut down one of Moscow's key airports for some time and had to cancel more than 50 flights because the IT system was vulnerable. And that again is what you and I have discussed, which is this is a war on multiple fronts. Yeah. And as much as I appreciate we take a hook like Trump's headline statement, the challenge of covering this war, but the necessary challenge of covering this war is to really evaluate then how action is taken on multiple fronts that intersect with each other. And I have to say, if we want to take away for this, I'm never optimistic about this. Nobody can be optimistic about this. But I'd say in the past couple of weeks, I think Ukraine's in a better space now with the Europeans, with the Americans, and therefore in a better space regarding this war on multiple fronts because of a series of developments. And that's despite the fact they're still under pressure on the front line, especially in Donetsk.
Yeah. The other thing that struck me about India and breaking it away is that Indian Pakistani spat that happened. It came out very clearly the amount of support that Pakistanis are getting from the Chinese, and therefore that will have raised Donald Trump's eyebrows, or certainly those that are advising him from within the Department of Defense. But President Zelensky has had his own troubles here. During a conversation with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, he stressed that the new draft law guaranteeing independence of Ukraine's anti-corruption institutions would be adopted as early as the beginning of this week. He said that in a conversation focused on Ukraine's European integration, further strengthening sanctions against Russia, the work of Ukraine's anti-corruption infrastructure. That was playing out where there were protests on the streets in Kyiv against Zelensky. Do you think that his announcement about guaranteeing the independence, this new law, will put those protests to bed? Or is that a little fracture that the Russians are going to be able to exploit more and try and undermine what Trump has just come out with?
Yeah, thanks for raising this, Phil. I think it's a key story, and it's one where I'm going to combine a bit of analysis with just personal perspective, if you don't mind. When this story broke, it would have been the way things, I think it was last Tuesday, actually, when Parliament passed, it was actually amendments to a broader bill. They snuck them in, and the amendments effectively gave the prosecutor general control over two key agencies, what's called the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office.
Yeah.
Now, those people who know Ukraine's history or have begun to learn about it because of the Russian invasion will know that corruption has been this massive issue in Ukraine since independence. It encompasses the economic sector, the political sector, the social sectors. Even when we got the hope of the 2014 Maidan Revolution, which in large part was about the corruption of the pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych. There was a period, with respect, because he's still around as a politician, but I'm going to say this, under Poroshenko, there was a great deal of corruption.
Yeah.
And one of the prospects of Zelensky coming in 2019 is he ran on the fact that he would come in and deal with the corruption, and indeed the establishment of these offices, as well as other independent Ukrainian anti-corruption organizations, NGOs, has been a very positive development. I mean, there are still issues over corruption. You'll remember the major military scandal that eventually forced the resignation of the defense minister Reznikov a couple of years ago about the overinflated tenders for food in the military. Everybody in Ukraine knows this. What happens last week is all of a sudden these parliament amendments passed, and the personal perspective is that I had friends in Ukraine. I mean, really close friends who've been there, who I've learned a lot from, and these are really good people. And they are absolutely just agitated because this strikes at the core of what they have been seeking as Ukrainians, which is a better society. Leave aside the invasion if you can, for a better society and for a better politics. Now, when you put the invasion on top of this, what you have is this strikes at that drive to make a responsible Ukraine for its people. And it also gives the Russians a huge propaganda opportunity. And it also threatens the Ukrainian path to accession to the EU, because we know, and it's going to take some time, but we know that anti-corruption is a key element of when you apply to become the EU. You've got to show responsibility.
Yeah.
And I'd say probably that on that Tuesday last week, and it was interesting because I have some friends who are just ardent supporters of Ukrainians as well, but they were saying, look, we understand why Zelensky's doing this, or we want to understand it. There's the Russian influence, which is still in Ukraine. These corruption bureaus have not handled certain cases well, and I listened to them, And I said, look, with respect, folks, I got to tell you this. This isn't what's happening here. There's an attempt to curb these bureaus that's taking place.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got my friends in Ukraine are saying it's because it's to protect certain people in the government.
Yeah.
Now, I will not name names here, but there is one particular well-placed individual who is in the news each and every day, and indeed was in the news today.
Yeah.
And there were protests over this individual. You know who I'm talking about. But
I know exactly who you're talking about.
There were protests over this individual, and he's not going to leave the government anytime soon.
Mm-hmm.
And those protesters know that. But so this is why they're agitated. It's like, and what I said, I remember I did a couple of spot interviews on it on the day, is I said, look, what I'm hoping, and I had to say, so what I'm hoping here is that Zelensky's going to realize this is a really bad step,
mm-hmm.
and he's going to recalibrate. By Thursday, in part because thousands of Ukrainians came out on the streets, including in Kyiv, and because the EU expressed its concern and international partners expressed their concern, Zelensky walked it back.
Yeah.
And he puts forth this revised bill. Now, where we are now is that this bill would maintain the independence of the anti-corruption bureaus. They still will liaise, as I understand it, with the prosecutor general. They will still keep the prosecutor general informed, but they're still autonomous.
Yeah.
Importantly, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau has said they're reassured, and that's important for me. The kicker is that Parliament recessed immediately after passing this bill last week to go on a 4-week recess. Now, Zelensky has called them back in to a special session for the 31st, which is this Thursday. The worry amongst my friends is some legislators may choose not to come back.
Yeah.
And I think the Zelensky government's got to make sure they've got a quorum there to get this through. And I think if this gets through, and this is one of those strange things, I'm going to actually tell you, this turns out to be a net positive.
Yeah.
For all the Russian propaganda that's tried to exploit this, and you'll know the usual suspects who've done this, including in the UK, Ireland, and the rest of Europe and the US. What you saw were people in Ukraine who had fought for their political space in 2014, or some people who were even too young in 2014. And those folks went to the streets in 2025.
Yeah.
In the middle of a war, they told the government, this is not right.
Yeah.
And they told them in no uncertain terms it's not right. If you want to talk about what a democracy should mean, even a flawed democracy in wartime, this was it. Because again, I wasn't going to play whataboutism, but I was like, could you imagine that type of demonstration taking place in Red Square?
Yeah.
Ain't no damn way.
But again, should we be surprised, because the Ukrainian democracy is very, very young, and it was when it came in, it grew out of the old Soviet and Russian type of government, which is underpinned by corruption the whole way through, and all of the presidents prior to Zelensky continued with that and enjoyed the corrupt activities that were going on and underpinning their governments. Zelensky's the first to come in, and with him being focused on so many different aspects of trying to get Ukraine through the war, I'm not surprised he took his eye off the ball slightly, and one of his senior advisors and influencers, who will still have been enjoying some of the benefits from wider corrupt practices, hasn't taken an opportunity to try and slip something through, which he's embarrassed Zelensky, and Zelensky will almost certainly deal with him in his own quiet way afterwards. But I personally am not surprised that it's happened. I'm just surprised it's taken so long for something like this to happen, given the pressures that there are on Zelensky himself.
No, I mean, look, newsflash, every government has corruption in wartime. I can tell you stories about Britain in World War II as a historian, right? That wasn't
just in wartime, or corruption all of the time.
No, I'm just highlighting wartime as a special case here for our listeners out here, right? I think the thing here is that when you're fighting what is a war, which is an information war and a propaganda war. What is it? Is it Lot's wife? They say, you got to be whiter than white. And that was that, especially when Ukraine is looking beyond the war in terms of the economic and political future, which is a future which is with the EU. I think that's quite clear now. And especially when Ukraine's defense industry is vastly expanding, as you and I have discussed. And when you're talking about a lot of money that's going to the defense industry,
Yep.
you're going to want the reassurances that money's not going to go walkabout, that it's going to be used efficiently. So even though this corruption takes place, look, Ukraine, which has fought this valiant war as the underdog, what it needed to do was to make sure that it did not handicap itself with this piece of legislation. I mean, what I would hope in a dream world, a couple of these advisors would be out of the government.
Yeah.
And I will repeat that. And by the way, as a further clue for people who want to research this, I'm going to recommend an article to you. I know we should shout out the Times, and we'll always shout out the Times to do great coverage. But the Financial Times, I will give them a shout out here with an article by Christopher Miller over the weekend on a particular Ukrainian advisor that I think bears looking at, because here's where all this comes about. What I was finding in the last few weeks is this was getting interesting. There was a lot of briefing against this Ukrainian advisor, which is coming out from the Americans and from the Europeans, which was, we really want to help Ukraine. We really want to do this. And this is just getting in our way. And I kept wondering, why are they briefing so heavily against? Ding, ding, ding. Because the stories about the corruption are known.
Yeah.
And it just happened that Parliament forced the issue. And I do think they caught Zelensky by surprise. I think he made, however, and again, he made a huge mistake signing the bill.
Yeah.
Massive mistake. Because that ruins his reputation as the defender of a Ukraine that doesn't do this type of stuff anymore. Yeah. And, you know, like I said, if they redeem themselves July 31st, and if we get into August where we put all the pieces back together, that means that the Europeans don't suspend their financial aid. That means that we're getting flow through on some of the military aid. Another news story this week, the first Patriots from the U.S. have come via Germany into Ukraine. 3 systems is my understanding. And Zelensky's expecting 7 more. So, you know, this is a key time. This is a key time because I think the Russians have that window. How long do you think it'll be? I mean, have they got a window 6 months, a year? And then I don't think Russia can prosecute this war in the same way.
Yeah, well, I'm also hearing rumors on the net that there's some restructuring going to go on amongst those that are advising and representing Ukraine in different places. And you know, it seems that Zelensky has been looking at this for a while, and maybe someone has tried to undermine his position. But what it shows to me is that, you know, the checks and balances are in place, and the ultimate check and balance is the democratic process in the country, and that allows people to get out and peacefully protest on the streets if they think something's wrong. And, you know, Zelensky, give him his due, has listened to it and recognized what's gone wrong and dealt with it. But how do you think this is going to play out? You know, both, you know, from a Russian perspective, from a Ukrainian perspective, and from a Western perspective over the next few days and weeks.
What a silver lining. You know, Trump is a silver lining here. I think the fact here is that corruption story, that internal Ukrainian division, again, provided they right the ship this week, Trump has basically taken the oxygen out of that story by seizing the headlines. And so once again, we're back to the question of, do we have a unified international community behind Ukraine and the resistance against the Russians? I'd say probably, I'll put down a few markers what I'm looking for. One is the Russians really, really need a propaganda victory on the Eastern Front.
Yeah.
They're taking individual villages, but they've had a bit of a setback. If those people who are really watching this carefully up in Sumy, which is the border region in the Northeast, this was really important because the Russians were trying not only to put pressure on 4 Ukrainian regions, they wanted to add 2 more, Sumy and Kharkiv.
Yeah.
And they were trying to, they would call it a buffer zone, but to take territory in Sumy. Ukrainians are actually regaining some of that territory. Zelensky mentioned it a couple of days ago. So what Russia needs is Russia needs to try to take this logistics hub, or former logistics hub, because the place has been leveled, of Pokrovsk in Donetsk. You know, it's not enough just to take villages. They need another town to tell their people huge success. And they could get Pokrovsk, but I tell you what, it's now over a year since they started that assault.
Oh, it's another Bakhmut.
Exactly. It's another Bakhmut. So it's not like the Russians are making huge gains. And meanwhile, a story to watch, because I don't think it's just spin, is that Kiev School of Economics
Mm-hmm.
did a survey which has just come out, which is that the Russians are now back. They've depleted their Soviet era equipment,
Mm-hmm.
and their level of supply from Russia to the front lines is now back to pre-2022 levels.
Yeah.
Now, you have to be careful about that because, of course, there's new forms of warfare, such as drones, which kind of has to be configured in here. But if the Russians are facing resource strains, that's a story to play with. Mm-hmm. Economically, you and I have talked about the sanctions and the Russian constraints. Then, on the other hand, what I think you have to look at in terms of Ukraine is that the EU continues to keep its act together. So I'll add one more thing that is mm-hmm. massive here that's come out, because I don't think the media has quite clocked this as well. I've been doing interviews on the other front of Trump's tariff mm-hmm. chaos, yada, yada, yada. For all the downside of that lose-lose framework with the EU, because no one wins in a tariff exchange. There are two provisions mm-hmm. in that tariff that are important for Ukraine. And I have to hand it to the EU. And you and I have both been critics of the EU in the past.
Yeah,
they don't necessarily operate the most effectively. But man, they played a bad hand brilliantly here. The first thing they said to Trump is, we're going to invest in your defense industry.
Yeah.
And that's $600 billion. Now, it may not be $600 billion, but what they've actually done is they've actually told the Americans, we're going to buy your military equipment.
Yeah.
Because it's part of the EU expansion of defense production and defense investment, some of which will go to Ukraine, right? Mm-hmm. So now they're locking in not only the Patriots, but other forms of U.S. equipment, because Trump sees it as a business deal, right?
Yes.
Secondly, $750 billion of American energy products.
Yeah.
Now, it may not be $750 billion, but the EU put a figure of $250 billion per year for 3 years.
Yeah.
Now, American liquefied natural gas, American oil, American nuclear fuel. Now, why are they doing that? Well, the EU is committed to cutting all supplies of Russian oil by 2027. Certain countries like Hungary, Slovakia say, oh, don't know about that. We like our mm-hmm. Russian energy supplies. Now the EU is going to be able to go to those folks and some others in the bloc and say, look, we've got supply that's been issued from the United States. It's the frustrating thing for all analysts, and you and I know this, is marathon, not a sprint. We'll repeat it again.
Yeah.
But apart from the Ukraine, that flutter in Ukraine, and that's actually, I shouldn't say flutter, apart from that serious issue that flared in Ukraine, it's been that example of that if you get beyond the headlines and the chatter, Ukraine's not only resisting,
but it's winning.
I'd be careful with winning, Philip. Be careful. Now, you and I'll just slightly disagree with that. What I'd say with it, Ukraine is punching back.
Yeah.
Okay. And what I'd say with this, and why I'm careful with winning, Philip, and I value everything you say on that, is at the end of the day, it's not a winning which is going to be in the case of a military victory over Russia.
Oh, exactly.
Exactly. But in the ability to have withstood what is the most serious assault on European soil, I think probably we would say since 1945.
Yeah.
Now, as a smaller country, to maintain the large part of your nation and to do it as a democracy in which most of the nation is invested, that even if they're critical of Zelensky, and many of them have been, they believe in Ukraine. So in other words, they stand. Ukraine stands. And
Exactly. No, I agree with you completely on that. And more accurately, I should have said Russia is losing because it's lost its strategic goals already. That doesn't necessarily, as you quite eloquently said, that Ukraine is necessarily winning at this stage. But Scott, I think on that note, that is a good time to stop because it gives us lots more to talk about at some stage in the future. It's been a real pleasure talking to you once again on Frontline.
Onwards and upwards. Always great to talk to you, Philip.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.